Hey, it's Paul Bates with GreatDad.com, and I'm here with my weekly series of talks with dads, modern dads, trying to get a feel for the pulse of fatherhood today. And I've got a guest today from Australia who will have a different point of view, but on a lot of the subjects we are constantly talking about resilience and what the meaning of fatherhood is, and maybe we'll get into a couple other subjects. So welcome, Nick Berman.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate your time and really grateful for the invite to come onto your show. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, Nick, you're now doing a lot more coaching, but maybe we should start with what your background was before and how you've moved into the coaching space.
Yeah, of course. I guess I'm 47 and I basically have been recruiting and working in advertising for most of my career, my 20s and 20 years in recruitment. I realized I was spending way too much time with people. Like just by default, I was really just, I was making good money. I was making great money and paying my bills and doing the targets. But then I was like actually getting to know these people on quite a significant level. So my connection and my human relation skills were high value in that space. So it was only actually, I think that's when I spoke to you before about, like, it's been 3 years now into a long-term separation. And it was only then that I gained freedom in the space to develop my awareness of my potential, and not that the relationship held me back, but I allowed it to hold me back. I chose on some level for it to hold me back. And now, despite the challenge of, still recruit, but I'm limited on who I work with. It's more the working within a sort of mindset and career coaching, life coaching aspect, particularly with it's so enjoyable working with dads, and men who are in a space of transition. I mean, we're all in transition, Paul. You can relate to that. No matter what you believe or you don't believe, or no matter how much routine you have in your life, you're still transitioning. So, it's worth being really conscious in that. And that's where a lot of the gold is in the conversations I have, bringing people into that space.
Yeah, well, it's not an uncommon story in the mid-40s. I mean, some people have big midlife crises, but it's just always a time for change and introspection. And I can understand how if you're naturally good with people and wanted to dig deeper, I mean, coaching is a way to work with some of those skills and get to have deeper conversations with some of those coaching clients, I'm sure.
Yeah, massively. And, no matter what happens in society with technology and numbers, and I know that there's the population of the world is just growing everywhere at the moment. It doesn't stop, doesn't slow down, and we're seeing that around cities and how the influx and growth is impacting it. We're still individuals, we're still independently so individual, and actually believing that you're a number on a like page or a share page or something is great, but it's also knowing your traits. For me as a 47-year-old man, there's no other 47-year-old man like me. There's no other 47-year-old dad like me. And so actually embracing, loving those parts that are very individual and very capable and trusting them has been where the gold has been at for me, where my potential has been at. It's been fabulous.
So the coaching is kind of new, but you're still focusing on some of the same macro issues, leadership, personal branding, career development, that type of thing, or has the...
Yeah, it's a bit of column A, that being column A, and it's a bit of like trust. It's a bit like, and trust established in relationship with self. It's the start of everything. And so essentially, it's not just work, it's a mortgage, it's a relationship, it's parenthood, it's finance, it's your relationship with those things. And you may well be functioning on a level of very, like a frequency of just, this is where my life's at, this is where I'm happy. But inevitably, your kids grow up, you pay your mortgage off or you don't. Do you change jobs or you don't? And it's like, well, what's your aspiration here? Like, what's your path that you're wanting to create for yourself consciously, rather than doing what we learned we should do, being shown what we should do. And I can speak to men in this, and it's not every man, but I mean, I can speak for myself, is that I didn't want to make any choices in my relationship, like my long-term family relationship. Every time there was an offer, I was like, well, what should we do? Or let's just do what you want, not make a conscious choice for myself. So a lot of my work comes around to conscious choice and delivering, like a support to people, parents who are capable of like wanting a little bit more, making them aware there is an option to have a little bit more. And then it's recognizing the perspective that is gained through that conversation. So the subject matter, people see me as a career guy because of the 20 years working with people. But it's like, clearly, as I said to you, it's the conversation is more about the human, Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've talked to quite a few people as I've delved deeper into this idea of resilience, which was kind of a buzzword right at this point in time. But
Mm.
it means being strong enough to handle what's happening in front of you, and kind of next to what you're saying, but people have talked about the why or your purpose, like you say,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
really the basis, a large part of the basis of how you can be that strong person.
Yeah, I love resilience. I mean, I love resilience as a tool. I mean, I agree with you, and I think we had it for a few years before, where empathy was the latest buzzword. Like, I'm so empathetic. I have real empathy, and I mean, these things are just words. They are just words,
Right.
and they can have an action associated with them, but they are just words. And if we use the word, we don't use the word, we don't act the word, then it's actually redundant. It's somewhat, again, in this, as we talked about before, saturation point hits in this world. But what I do know is, if you can ask yourself as a man or as a dad or as a partner or as whatever your role is in your family setup, it's about, could you be doing a little bit more for yourself? And it's almost just, even just starting that, people say, well, where do you start this work, Nick? How do I become more resilient? How do I start the inner work? How do I begin to trust myself more? And if you start asking those questions, you're doing it already, like you've started.
Right.
And it's actually establishing the grounds of trust that you're on your path. You're on the path you're supposed to be in. But these things, and I think resilience is an inquiry now these days. It's like, because our perception of mental health, our perception of society and where things are at, our perception of younger generations, is resilience there? Is potential there? And it's all there. It's all there for the individual. It's just whether they want to find it, whether they trust themselves enough to be like, well, build up a few more layers of skin. If you do chin ups at the gym pool, which I'm sure you do, but you build calluses up,
Yeah.
build up skin, you build up calluses, and you build up that energy in that space, and you become more potential. It becomes more potential. The same thing applies with something like resilience. The more you use it, more it's ingrained into your system. It becomes part of who you are, rather than like a separate thing, which I want to be more resilient. It's like, I am being more resilient. It's two phrases, and they're both really powerful, but one's acting like you're not doing it, and the other one's acting like it's, and it's literally, that's where I'm communicating with. And I'm big on language, and you might get that from this chat.
Well, I do think there's a challenge that we have, as certainly in that mid-career point where you've got the kids, you've got the relationship, you've got the house, you've got the mortgage, you've got all that stuff, and you're kind of just going through the day to day. And when you're in the day to day, you've got all those challenges, fight with the partner, dropping off the kids, feeding them, grocery store, bad boss, all that stuff. And
Yeah.
if you're not careful, you don't pose those hard questions to yourself about what comes next, what does it mean, till a little later when you have a crisis.
Yeah.
Is that the way you see in your clients as well? Because I think a lot of people don't go into coaching until they either want to get something done, like a book or something, or they're having a crisis that they've decided therapy is not it's not a therapy related crisis. It's a searching for next step crisis.
I'm really mindful of the word crisis. Like, crisis, when you say it, not saying it's you saying it, but when I hear it in that manner, I think about trauma, and I think about challenge.
Yeah.
And none of those things are bad, right? None of them are bad. Again, I'm big on use of language. They're words, right? So if it's, I feel like with my clients, I try to get them to relate how they're feeling in the situation, because of how we've learned our behavior from our parents and our siblings and our teachers and our grandparents. It's probably not exactly ours, like, especially if we're talking about a generation. For me, being someone in the 40s, in my 40s, my parents were brought up by people that are in war-torn London, like bombs, but fire, stuff going off. And I'm like, that would have been really hard. And I can't even imagine what that would have been like. But I know there would have been trauma there. I know there would have been crisis there. So now for me, I'm like, well, simplify it, bring people into a more conscious space of mindfulness around their language, mindfulness around their energy and what I'm reading and how I'm engaging in a conversation with them, and gently hold them accountable. I don't sort of tell them they're wrong. I don't tell them they need this, because that's not going to serve the purpose. That's going to be triggering probably. And excuse my French, who the fuck am I just to tell you what's what? But what I can do is I can certainly observe you in your moment of crisis, in your moment of trauma, and your moment of difficulty, and say, that must be really hard. You know, when someone actually comes into a space and they can be honorable and considerate to themselves, I have in me as a coach, I have this emotional lift of gratitude and appreciation that what I'm doing is worthy and there's value in it, not financial value, but emotional value. Yeah. Did I answer your question and a few other questions there, Paul?
Yeah, no, I think that's as a coach, I certainly understand what you're talking about. In my training, coactive training, we talk about people being naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And the idea that the client comes with all that potential within them. As a coach, you ask them the questions and you try to get them to find out who they are and what they want, rather than, as you say, giving them specific advice. Now, you've done some thinking about fatherhood, and you talk about fatherhood on purpose. Can you explain what that means to you? I mean, you've got little kids, so you haven't seen yet the fruits of your labor.
Yeah. Well, I've got a pre-teener, and I tell you what, it feels like I'm talking to a 19-year-old sometimes, and I'm like, so I can just imagine. Actually, I've got to be mindful that I'm not actually projecting my expectations into that space, therefore introducing potential that's mine, rather than theirs. But it's also, that's my childhood stuff. Yeah, fatherhood. Like, I live in a relatively rural area. And it's been really this is just part of my philosophy, and it's I live a relatively barefoot life unless I'm going to a city. I like to ground in. I like fire. I'm a bit of a wild man. I accidentally shaved my beard off 2 days ago, which is somewhat upsetting to me, but I'll get over that with a shave, not on purpose.
Okay.
But,
that's another story.
But no, so I just feel like, my healing, as a parent, my healing for myself from my generational piece from my parents has actually been through parenting and parenting with purpose, and actually giving it, being separated from my children and being so devastated. And actually, I realized that, on some level, I was living out my parents' perception of being a single dad, not living with my children, their judgment, my grandparents' judgment, the religious connotations of being a single parent. And I was like, that's not mine. I don't want that. Like, why do I want that? I mean, there's a lot of other stuff I carry with that. But if I make a conscious choice, what I want to do is, like, when I'm with my children, I'm with them. My focus is with them. And of course, I'm going to miss out on things. There's 3 of them. There's a lot of voices there going on at one time. And I only have capacity. And I think, like a lot of parents, feel like they could do more. But I think that's just being a parent. But, like, sitting with them and seeing them and feeling them and listening to them and how their energy is, like, moving either toward or away from you, like being able to observe them. I have so much more potential in that now. I'm a single dad. Now I don't have, I guess I would say, a relatively controlling partner, but that's just modern life. It's like part of the situation. I allowed that, I enabled that, I chose that on whatever level at that time. But yet what I go to now is I actually get the time with my children on my own. I get to parent with purpose for myself, and that. So I get this channel of, there's the little Nick in me, the person who I am on the inside, who needs to be parented with purpose. And then I've got, like, I can relate to a 9-year-old who, like, I got told I was dyslexic by teachers when I was 9. This is in the 80s. And I proceeded to get bullied by these people, like in a private school, in a fancy, expensive private school. And I just felt I probably was detached somewhat from the emotional stuff, but now I'm like, well, that part of me needs love. That part of me needs, but then I've got these children around me that are around that age. I'm like, what a beautiful opportunity for me to connect with that part of myself and be present with purpose and love, And so that feels like the highest form of self-kindness to me, really, like as a dad, being part of that ecosystem, creating it for myself, not in a manipulative way or a controlling way, but just a conscious way that, we're all essentially kids in adult brains here, in adult minds, and the expectations of society and who we are and mortgages and jobs. And I get it. I do get it. But it's also like, well, with all the intention in the world, how can Paul be the best version of himself? Not best as in winning stuff, not best as in money making, not best, like, when you show up every day for yourself, what can you do? And that's what I feel like I can do now from the position I'm in, with the purpose,
So the separation really heightened that for you. Is there a way that dads can get ahead of that to understand that in some way without having to
Yeah.
have gone through that kind of experience? Because
Yeah, I feel like it almost, I feel like it sort of comes back to these points of being, like some of the tools around becoming more resilient, being more capable, and trusting yourself. And so I think that anyone that's prepared to do some inner work, and whether you have a counselor or not, you don't necessarily need to perceive yourself. I mean, psychologists just don't perceive yourself as broken. Just because someone else has said that and told that to you, don't perceive it as some form of weakness. Actually, it's the highest form of strength is actually showing compassion for yourself and trusting there's part of you that just needs to be recognized and seen in these situations. I feel like it's a question I get asked a lot about how do you know? Like, how do you know when you need this? And we haven't been shown, Paul, like we haven't been shown how to do this. Like in society, it's more about what's next. I need more money. I need a newer car, a new set of golf clubs, a new partner. It's like always something new. Where actually the big new thing that people need to, I feel like dads probably, and I can relate to them mainly in this situation, is itself.
right,
So slowing, like mindfulness practices like breath work and meditation and yoga, things that's going to slow our system down to actually know whether our system wants that thing that we're doing, the choice that we're doing. And it might be marriage, it might be another child. But if we're just doing what somebody else is saying and doing because that's what my dad did with my mum, and I saw that dynamic, doesn't mean it's right for us. It doesn't mean it's right for either partner, but it's what society's led to now, where the patriarchal systems that we're living in the Western world, in whatever form you perceive it being, which everyone sees different stuff in this way, and masculinity and toxic masculinity, and women have an equal contribution into that space. I know, and I'm not talking about in terms of people that have been physically and emotionally damaged in those situations. I'm talking about like it doesn't need to be a them and us. It doesn't need to be separate. Actually, every son that's been raised by, and sometimes it's not been raised by their parents, I understand that, but they've been raised by a mum and a dad in most instances in the past. So what have they had that model to them? How have they learned how to deal with that? And in some ways, it's just not there to be you haven't learned how to deal with this. I think most 47-year-old parents, like dads, aren't showing up for themselves enough. We're in a position where we talk a lot in social media and even podcasts about the negative rhetoric around toxic masculinity. Where are the gems? Where are the amazing people? I mean, I see them now. I'm seeing them more, and I can relate to them. And I want to be, almost viewed in that way because I just know that they're there. The people are there, and I actually challenge people when I go to conferences and events, and I say, I get why you're backing men. I get the perception. I get the violence, and the numbers is horrendous. It's so sick. There's numbers that are coming out with domestic violence in Australia still, and it's just so high, and it's somewhat sickening being a dad to children in this world, knowing that. But what I do know is I can, as a container, I can change that. Even just as someone that's not a coach, as an observer, I can witness that and say, well, how am I showing up in my life? Can I reach out to somebody like a coach or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, or even just some inquiry? We don't know the answers. We just don't know the answers. And that's okay. You're safe in not knowing the answers. Like it's actually that's how we learn. That's how we learn. Like you can read a book on parenting and you can follow someone else's rhythm. You get your parents, your siblings. It's not going to be your journey. Your triggers, those triggers, every effing person in the world has triggers. And the more familiar we can relate to those, like whether you have trauma around it or not, it's just repetition of behavior or repetition of interaction in an uncomfortable manner that causes these things. If you, like, I can feel my body reacting now. I can literally, like, I was out last night, not late, but I went to walk to my car and I was like, I just need to sit down and relax after a busy day. I just need to do that. But I went to I was standing outside a bar and I don't know it very well. And I was like, my body was like, you don't want to be there. Like, it was like, literally, like, it was not convulsing like this, but it was like it just did this thing. And it knew. My body intuitively knew it didn't want to be in that space. But then I found this great bar that had live music. The energy was great in the space. And if you would have asked me 3 years to do this, I would have been like, go away. I'm a dad. I'm too busy. I've got work. I've got these things. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to. Leave me alone. And that's what my end of story would have been. I'm like, I don't have space for this. We all have space and we all have time. our calendars, our mental health, I can't speak on everyone's behalf, by the way, but like we almost put ourselves very much last, and that's what has to change, I guess. And is if we're not prepared to put ourselves, we need to care for our children, our partners. But if we don't put ourselves first in the way that we're operating, then the flow and effect is we're not caring for them.
Yeah, like it was what I'm hearing you saying that like that awareness of being alive rather than walking through being alive. I mean, there's one thing to be like to go to the bar and feel uncomfortable or too tired or a million one emotions rather than feeling and being present in the dynamic around you. I think it's kind of hard to explain to people what that difference is sometimes between like what I quite often say is like sleepwalking, or you hear people say sleepwalking through life, where you just kind of go, like you say, going through the motions, knowing that I'm going into that bar and I'm understanding what's happening. I'm hearing the music. I'm feeling the
it's
whole
really I think it's challenging. I think it's almost, and I don't know what level, but it's the counter level of social media in a way. You know, it's a real detachment. I'm only using social media as an example. I know I benefit from that in business and in work, but in terms of the escapism that exists there in our mind, the kind of escapism of like, I can go to this space, it's safe, I can tune out from my reality, it takes my focus around, you know, the discomfort, maybe my relationship, myself, my children, my partner. And actually everything is my endorphin here. It's okay, cool. I'll smoke, I'll drink. It's a similar kind of thing. I barely drink. Like I hadn't really drunk for 6 years, and now I have like a wine once a month. I just do it because it feels like, again, I'm relating to what my body's wanting rather than saying I need to drink 2 bottles of wine. And the more I can relate to myself, the ability to slow down. It's like society, the system, as we know, if you have kids, dads, you have kids, the routine of school drop-offs, the routine of sports drop-offs, the routine of dinners, breakfast, making lunches. I mean, it's wonderful, and you can certainly sustain it. I'd say if you want to sustain that, try to find the space within that space for yourself. So rather than feeling the mundane in it, feel the joy in it. Feel like, because again, when I was with my kids every day, I didn't always see the intricate changes that were going on. Now I do. And now as an observer of that, actually, rather than thinking I'm away from my kids for a chunk of time, I'm like, I get to see their isms more, their physical and emotional, mental, and the humor is just brilliant. And so, and the seriousness too, by the way, like that it comes with it. If we continue just to not operate, they're on their frequency, we're all running parallel. It's like, well, no, we should all be on the same frequency, relatively, you know, not in a controlling manner. Like, we're not forcing this. This is an observation. And if you can observe something that's not cohesive to you in your system with some of the methods that I practice within my practice, it's wonderful. Like, it's healing, you know, and I think it's healing for my child self inevitably. But then I say healing makes it sound like there's a damaged item. There's not a damaged item. It's healing in terms of creating a cohesive, honorable, loving system for my children. And that's what I'm wanting, and not must have school, must do this, must, you know, and why do we do? Because I don't know why they're doing it. They're following your lead. They're following your direction. Yeah.
Especially the young ones. Yeah. I think a lot of that comes back to the purpose. And if you have that defined and understand what it is, you can be more in the moment and appreciate those moments, whether it's the work thing or your life, you know, the life by yourself in the evening versus being with your kids rather than just doing it. And and then the end result coming out the other side, if you do that, what is the benefit that you see for either yourself or your clients in terms of that heightened awareness or that different appreciation?
So I think I'll just go to this point with my children. Like, firstly, like because it's in relationship with them where everything for me starts, but starting here is like the more present and conscious I am with them, the more I see them and they feel seen. And so actually, how do you commoditize that into a thing as your children actually seeing who you are, you know, not within anger or fury or somewhat the picture that was painted of me by my former partner. Like some of it's true, some of it's true for her. But if I actually act that out, like, then I'm that. But actually, if I introduce more conscious methods of communication with them, appropriate methods at appropriate age group and appropriate, like, like if they're pulling me up on something, so this is the first time I've been a dad to an X, Y, and Z kid. Like, I've not done that before. How am I going? You know, and how's that? How fun is that for kids telling them, actually, Dad, you know, you're doing good, or actually, Dad, you know, like, I don't like the new food you buy, you know, and I'm like, okay, cool, you know, and so it's actually inviting the potential conversation. That's where the gold is for me. So I get that feeling of, and I'm not going to say it's an endorphin hit, but it's like there's a pressure release in my system of connection, and whether it's trust, self-trust, whether it's trust with my clients and my children, the same thing applies. I don't know if I've mentioned it in this on the call so far, but I just get this release where I have an alignment call. It's my first part of my process with my clients, just to make sure that we're on the same page roughly on what we're doing. And I'm like, literally, I see a sparkle in their eye. I can, and whether it's true or it's the sparkle coming from me, and maybe I'm just projecting that into their space potentially. But that trust, like, it's almost a link in the chain occurs at that moment, and so therefore that bond is created. So then the communication, I feel like I don't have to sell anymore. Like, you know, and so that's why with me, a lot of my work in person is really, I regard that really highly. I need to go and meet people in person more. It's a human business, humans. Like, we have, and that it's a human business. So of course, the care and love you can show in person versus the care and love you can show, you know, online. You can do it. We can definitely do it, but it's like, well, somewhat numbing comparatively to me, you know.
I think that's a challenge for a lot of us who are trying to communicate that to dads, that there's this other level of experience that doesn't have to do with making more money or getting ahead in some way, that it's its own reward and doesn't have a monetary value. So sometimes hard to get people to realize the value of coaching in this realm, because people are so used to, like, selling something and getting a return.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. And actually return a good coach isn't always obvious.
Right.
It's actually not. Sometimes the subtleness of it is which actually where the gold is, because it's how that person's prepared to show up. Yeah. You know, really. And if they're not entirely there and they don't want to be entirely there, then they're not gonna see what they need. You know, maybe I say to a lot of the clients, like, you've started the work already. Like, you've actually started the work already by coming in, even sending me a text message or a message of some sort. You've started the work. So it's just, I feel like, a lot for me, a lot of the challenging mental health stuff, and people relate to drugs or emotional abuse, but I literally look to parents. I look at incredibly grounded men, dads, look incredibly grounded people. I'm like, so why is this person, like, it looks like they've just learned, there's some dynamic in their system. It might be their mum, a grandparent, and their dad. It might be it, and that's part of what I find really interesting here. But in so many instances, really small shit can really just create trauma. Like, really small shit can create trauma, and then it gets exacerbated by the human thought. Where actually, if we can attend to that trauma in a really conscious kind, and someone knows that they've done the best they can. Like, I've got stuff. I live on the other side of the world with my family somewhat deliberately, but I've chosen that. But because I don't see them very often, my trauma has been exacerbated by lower interaction with those people. Like, it becomes, they did this, they did that, they did these things to me, they made that happen, and I haven't been able to process it. Where actually, I just invite the possibility of closure through, even if it's not through a coach, and if it's a sports group. And I know a lot of people play sports and they go and they socialize afterwards. This work is not done at a pub or a bar. It's not. I mean, that will be a release. If you can vent and you can express, like, truly express how you're feeling, that's wonderful. But the minute someone else, including a coach, offers too much opinion in your space, it's not your space anymore.
And that's where friendships, as great as they are, it's hard to have a real coaching conversation, because coaching conversations they're a conversation, but it is really a one-way focus on the client, and it's a rare opportunity to have that kind of talk with somebody who's curious and who wants the best for you. I did want to touch on, because in your profile you talked about having an opinion about masculinity today, and we talked a little bit about that, toxic masculinity versus masculinity. I keep on getting worried, as a lot of people do, that men are being thrown, values that men hold dear are being thrown out with all the bad stuff. What do you think are the real values of masculinity that we can go forward and be, if not proud of as men, embrace?
Yeah, of course. I feel like social media, one of the really big benefits is we can find people to look up to. We can find people the same way we can see people that are having, like, causing havoc, because you look at social media and it does like negative rhetoric and negative story and does feed that. And I think when you look at, like, for example, a world like the UFC, for example, where there's a lot of, it's a really physical sport, it's very based on physicality, but a lot of those guys are super smart people, and it's that they're showmen, that they do get hurt, but they're really intelligent, they're really capable, and they're putting on a show. Like, a lot of it's like a bit like WWF wrestling to a degree, but with more physicality. And so what I would invite the possibility is within the framework of where you're seeking whether it's through sports or whether it's through politics or through, there will be people within the existence that you can find. And it might be someone on the other side of the world. And I know you're American, I know you're from California, and I know, but I feel like everyone has a possibility of looking for idols now. It doesn't necessarily need to come in the form of you could like a character in a movie, but I feel like, the person that does exist behind that, there's actually some really interesting idyllic things that are going on there that we can find out about. And then a lot of it's not bullshit, a lot of it's just true. And so, like, I'm 6'4", I'm a meter 92, and I'm a big guy. I mean, I'm not massive. I know there's bigger people and smaller people, but what I'm conscious about is that energetically speaking, people are pretty much always checking me out, not perving on me, but like, I actually go out of my way gently to interact with people. Like, if I feel like, how you going? Like, how's your day? And actually doing that on a human level, where building trust and rapport with somebody. I'm not a celebrity, and I'm not claiming to be anything of a celebrity, but what I do have is I'm a master manifester. So I have big energy. And so me being mindful of that and actually bringing people into that space with just, for a few seconds and saying, hey, how's it going? Actually could be like a really big gift. And as an observation, it's like, well, as a man, my responsibility, and as a dad as well, like, my responsibility is to admire. Like, I really appreciate if I go to the park and if I don't have one of my kids with me, without being weird, I say, it looks like you did a wonderful job, like, how are you? Like, we don't have to have so many boundaries in our mind around what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And that's part of my journey, is diffusing that, taking that, giving that real context for me. And I do that through human interaction.
Yeah, what I'm hearing there is inclusion. I mean, maybe not in the way that we're currently using it in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but more bringing people in aspect that used to be the bedrock of why we were taught etiquette in schools back a million years ago. Was not so much that we would be superior to the person not following the etiquette, but a lot of the etiquette was actually developed so that people knew what to do and that they would all feel included somehow. I know that's hard to imagine now, but that was the idea rather than exclude.
Yeah.
But the inclusion part, I think, could be a big part of what men could have as a value that is very positive and seems to come natural to a lot of us. I mean, even the introverts. I'm an introvert, but I understand the value of inclusion.
Yeah, and even labeling yourself as an introvert, or someone else labeling you as an introvert, that's great. It's good, as a great observation. But, like, how do you operate as an individual within that framework of, like, what you're putting out there and how you're, modeling to your clients and how you're doing that? And I'm sure you've been really mindful from the way you've communicated me briefly. I believe you're doing that. And we don't have to be a coach to do this.
No,
we don't have to be someone we can inspire. Like, and that's part of this beautiful work of what I'm doing but, like, I grew up in the 80s and in London, and there was fences, and there was the housing situation of, like, big houses. You need to protect yourself. You need alarms. You can't leave your doors open anymore. Like, people in the streets in towns around the UK or Great Britain, people would have their doors open. Their neighbours' kids would just wander in their door. They would come in, and it's like we've actually polarizing it the opposite way now. And so, yeah, we should be worried, because stuff does happen, shit stuff does happen, gross stuff does happen in this world. And yet, if that's the first thing we're going to go to, then our internal security thing, our flight or flight is on. So how do we, if I'm in the middle of a city walking past people, and I just engage eye contact. If I can admire someone, like last night, there was just a really interesting person. I talked to them at the bar. I never would have done that like ever before, because like, oh, I don't want to do it. It's like, am I coming onto them? Am I, like, what is that?
Yeah.
And actually now I'm like, well, why can't I compliment someone on their shirt or an outfit or the way that, and it's like, well, the more we can do that, like break down essentially the barriers of fear and uncertainty, I feel like there's easing conversation, which essentially it shouldn't be resilience, but that is the start of resilience. But in some of these ways, accepting society is overprotective in these spaces. We can't trust everyone, Paul. We can't. Like, we just can't. And I get it. And I'm not saying you should. But in our instinct, our gut instinct, the way that we want to operate, you as you referred to yourself as an introvert before, knowing that, what you're putting out in the world and how you're going to communicate with the world. The more familiar we can be with not necessarily labeling ourselves, but what we're comfortable with. Like, I wasn't uncomfortable with going into that bar. Like, okay, cool. It's that, become more conscious. I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm doing it as a dad, as a business owner, as a partner, as a son, all the expectations that have been painted of me. Are any of them mine? Are actually any of these mine? And I'm like, well, they weren't. And so now, like, what I probably would invite your listeners to say, well, what is who am I doing these things for? Like, why am I doing them? Like, am I doing them from source, or am I doing them from protection from the rest of the world? They need a nicer school so they can earn more money, and then they need a nicer school and I'm like, well, a job's going to exist the way that we think they do in 10, 15, 20 years, and we're spending all this money on education for what reason? And I'm not saying that is true or false. I just don't know.
Right.
And me accepting that it makes it easier for me, rather than be like, oh.
Well, there's a lot of questions here about what other things are potentially masculine, and also how they butt up against what's going on in the outside world, where it's hard for a man nowadays to compliment somebody without being considered like, what are you doing? Why are you having this interaction?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I don't know whether that means we need to change or be sensitive to the parts, the ways to do that in a way that's not perceived as threatening. But it is.
I think it's definitely together though. Like, you talked about inclusion before, but I think it's inclusion of all the aspects, the feminine females, the masculine females, and the feminine males. The trans. It's everyone's got a voice here. But it's not about yelling as loud as you can to get as many followers as you can. It's sitting down next to someone and saying, like, that must have been a really tricky situation, and really respecting that and coming.
Yeah, and up to us to take it back from those loud voices who are making some of these really positive attributes into negatives. Yeah.
Yeah. And as you know, like, people can believe everyone's perspectives is theirs. Everyone's is their own. And so by modeling healthy, balanced, aware people, like we can do in social media, like I got invited to speak or to be on the stage at a conference, and it was in the design sphere, which was where I was working, and I was scared senseless, mate. There's 500 people. I'd never done like public speaking, but I was on stage with someone else for a day, and I did it, and people said to me the most wonderful thing was the vulnerability I showed. And I just had in my voice the whole time, failure, why are you doing this? Like, the opportunity to put myself down. And actually, that was a really big tipping point for me of knowing, my potential of the ways people see me is different to how I see myself. And that's, I guess, I don't know, I'm segueing again. It's like alcohol is a really big issue. Like, we've got it's massive in Australia still, and despite the taxes going up, the price up, and less people drinking, it's still a really big thing because we've had it modeled to us. It's what someone said to me last week. A dear friend who works in the construction industry said it would be great to see someone like you working more with people in the construction industry, because the way, and it's not so making a targeted piece around those are the people that are doing the harmful things, but it's like, there is a certain sense of working really hard physically. They want to let their hair down, that feeling. And it's like, well, does it have to, because it's always been like that, does it always need to be like that? And I'm like, well, unless we start asking questions of inquiry gently, how do we know? Like, men can be soft, and it doesn't need to be soft in terms of sexuality. It doesn't need to be soft as in clothes you're going to wear or what you're going to talk about, but like, we as a manly man, as a strong, able-bodied man who has children, who needs to be a protector, you can still be soft, you can still be gentle, you can still be
Well, that's what the word you just used is the one that I quite often hear that's directly related to fatherhood is that protector role. And I don't think anybody could say that's a negative thing. There's no negative connotation from wanting to protect your kids. And if you think about it, I mean, protection from the outside, yeah, there are people out there who would do things, but being just in general protector from them falling on the stairs or, doing a lot.
Yes, yeah, but but in some ways, it does, like to other people, I feel like that could be perceived as aggression. From not, if you're looking after your children and taking care of them as the protector, it's wonderful. But then, if I'm down the park and if I'm being like overly cautious, and we have
Well,
this term,
anything taken to the extreme, I guess is.
yeah. But again, like it's just a societal. It's one of the spaces we're sitting in at the moment. Like there's so much polarized behavior.
Yeah. Well, this has been an interesting conversation. We've touched on a lot of points, and I can believe that you're a really great coach with working with men in these different fields. People can find you on Instagram and on the web. You've got Higher Ground, HIRE, like the word to hire somebody, higherground.co, and then the same thing for your Instagram handle, Higher Ground.
Yeah, highground.co as well. Yeah, that's right. And it's I think it's with practice that the conversations become more, when we're talking about like, well, how do we do this? And I'm like, well, it's not really been done before, so the feeling is, I think it's through more conversation, through going to places and men sharpening spaces that they wouldn't normally like to break the cycle of opinion, because I like women's events. I like going to those events and just saying, I don't need to contribute from a sexual perspective, but I'm certainly here to present and support. Like I've got 3 daughters. Yeah. But but they will do. And it's just been more like significant in that, like about being how the world is. If I can find those more feminine aspects in me that haven't been shown before, like who else sees that in me? How do they relate to me?
Yeah, I think I probably agree that women have a lot to teach us, but I don't want to become a woman. I mean, that's not, most men don't want to become women. We want to learn women, and women can have things that they can learn from us, hopefully at the same time. So I think that's kind of where we hope we'll go. All right.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your amazing podcast too. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. And we'll see you next time.
Have a good day. Cheers. Bye.